Hi there. In this tutorial we're going to walk through how to create a scene something like this one. So the general idea is that we have a background scene and we try to align our foreground scene with that. You can see we've got effects of sunlight shining on one side of the trees. There's a certain amount of translucency to some of the leaves of all these plants, and they're arranged in a fairly naturalistic way. And we have a number of different kinds of plants here, and you can see that there's some variation in the trees as well. I'll try to keep this tutorial not too long, but I think there's quite a lot to do, so it may take a little while. So to begin with, what we need to do is to create a plane, which is going to be our ground. So we'll simply add a mesh. I'll put the screencast keys on, and I'll press S to scale it, and in fact we'll scale it, we'll try 10 to start with. I'm not going to do everything to quite the same level of detail as I did for that scene, but obviously I'll show you all the basics of how to create it. And by the way, it's T to bring this left hand menu up and down. So we're now going to press Tab to go into edit mode, press W and subdivide. And I'm going to raise the subdivisions to 10 to start with, and then I'm going to press W, subdivide again, but this time I'm going to say fractal. And what fractal does, which is, as you can see a little bit further down this menu, adds a sort of, well, a fractal variation in the subdivisions. So you can see we're getting some bumps and things, and the bigger that number, the larger the variation. We want it reasonably sizable because we're going to smooth this out in a moment anyway. And the next thing we can do, because I want a path, is we can select a line like that, and if I turn on proportional editing and make sure that the area of effect is reasonably sizable and just pull it down like that. So I've still got the lumps and bumps, but now I've got an area that's a hollow, as it were, running through it. And you can obviously vary that a bit. It doesn't have to be a simple hollow. You might want to pull up some areas to have some raised bits in there. And if we were looking down the path that way, that's what we would see. So I'll just drop that little bit there. It's nice to have some areas that are sort of behind others. It gives you a sort of layered effect to the scene. Now this might not look very natural at the moment, but I'll obviously turn on smooth shading, and now we'll add a subdivision surface, and we don't need to put too many layers on it. I'll just turn off the grid floor. It's distracting. It's N, by the way, to bring up this menu. And now you can see we've got a fairly good start to a rough sort of surface. Before I go any further, go into edit mode, select all the vertices, mesh, unwrap, project from view bounds. So that will make sure that our ground unwraps properly. And I think what I will do now is I'll actually add the texture for that. So we'll come over here. It's going to be a fairly simple texture to start with, and it's just going to be an image, and I'll open up my textures, and you can download many of these from CG Textures and similar places, or you can use your own photographs. And I've got some ground textures and things like that, but I like for these sort of scenes to use sort of leaf mouldy sort of texture. I created these myself. For this one I think I'm going to use this one here. It looks slightly strange because I've essentially tiled it so that it is a seamless texture. So if we go to texture mode, you can see there it is. Now there's a bit more to do with the texturing. I will just do that now. It's fairly simple. I'll turn some lights on, and then we'll go to rendered mode. Obviously this isn't the finished article by any means. And then what I'll do is I'll go to the node editor up here. So it's very simple at the moment, and I like to disconnect the texture momentarily so it all goes white, but then if I now plug that into the displacement, you can see we start to get some texture. And if we put a colour ramp in there, we can play with that. We can play with what is actually selected for texture. Now if you look, you can probably see that these are sort of lines, these, I guess they're leaf stalks, are sort of sticking up at the moment. If we want them to go in, rather than adding an inversion node or anything like that, you can just push that past. But I'm quite happy with them being in that direction, and we just need to decide how much we want. Add a math node, set it to multiply, and then that allows us to increase and decrease the depth of the bump, as it were. And I generally use this at B-spline because it seems to give you a slightly softer effect. So that's about okay there. We might need a little bit more bump. We can play with that at a later date and put the colour back in, and there we are. So that's the basics for the ground. And we'll save that there. And now what we need to do is to start to build up other things to go on this ground. So if we go to another layer, and I'm going to build a tree to start with. So we'll add a simple, I think we'll start with a circle. It's one I commonly start with. It does for a lot of these sorts of shapes, and we'll get rid of that window up there. Look from the side view, go into orthographic. Go into edit mode, press E, and then turn off proportional editing, and then we can lift this up a little bit. We'll scale that in. You can use your own artistic license with this, obviously. I'm going to add a subsurf on this anyway. And how much detail you put into the trees obviously is up to you. Trees are obviously not completely symmetrical, but again they're not the central point of interest. Now we're not going to model an entire tree because we're not going to see an entire tree. We're only really going to see this sort of area. And I'll add a few more vertices or loops. And if you want to, you can pull areas out, particularly down here, to simulate roots and so on. It's entirely up to you. If we go into edit mode, in fact I'm just going to lower it slightly because that yellow dot, I want that to be that will be at ground level when we put this tree there, and I want the base of the tree just to be slightly underneath the ground so there's no gaps. So now we can come up here somewhere, we might see this sort of layer, and what I'm going to do is add a few more loops just about here. We'll go to face select mode, and it's easier if you select one of the cardinal directions for this, so that's, well, X and Y, and then I'm just going to select one of those faces. You could select 4, I'm going to go for 1 at the moment. Press E and then pull that out, and this is just going to be a very simple sort of dead branch. So I'm scaling in a little bit as I go. Obviously isn't a very convincing branch at the moment. What I'll do now is I'll add, say, here a loop there, another loop there, go back to face select, select that face, E to extrude, bring that out, scale it in, extrude it out again, and scale it in again. Scale that in a bit and push it out. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time modelling trees because obviously you can spend a lot more time doing that. And if we just select these 4 vertices, Control plus, by the way, will effectively run down the vertices and select more vertices, which can be quite handy. As you can see, that's given us a bit of a bend there. I could put more twigs or whatever on there. How many branches you do is entirely up to you. It's not really necessary to do too many, as it's mainly the lower part of the tree we're going to see. And then we'll add subdivision surface and set it to smooth shading. So you can see that's given us something approximating the trunk of a tree. And what we now need to do is unwrap it. Now, having this little branch here is going to add some complication to the unwrapping, so the best thing to do is to put a seam around the base of that branch. So Control E, mark seam, and what I will do also is I will select an edge running up there, so I've got an edge running all the way up, Control E, mark seam. It can get some difficulties with unwrapping cylinders, but it just takes a bit of time to get things to line up properly. You can fold things backwards and forwards to get them sorted out. So if we go to the UV image editor now, we select all the vertices, and what we need to do is put a bark texture up here. So to begin with, we'll just open an image and it will be a bark image. I quite like the sort of bark that I've got selected there. There's a lot of trees like that around where I live, but obviously you can use whatever you want. So this is the bark I used. I think I got this from CG Textures. It's not a tileable texture as such, but we'll see how we get on with it. So we now go to Mesh, Unwrap, and we just try Unwrap to start with. So that's not too bad. That's obviously the little branch down there, and there's the tree, the main part of the tree. So if we go to the material, once we've applied it, of course, so we go to New, and we just put a diffuse on there at the moment, and add an image texture, and we select the bark. So you can see at the moment, because there's obviously a variation in shading from one side to the other of this image, we've got a very clear line running down there. So to start to sort that out, we need to have a look at where that is. So obviously, because I put a line there, one of these edges is that line. Doesn't really matter which one. So if I select one edge and then Control Plus to take it to somewhere about the middle. In fact, before I do that, I'm going to make life simpler for myself. Always worth spending a bit of time with UV unwrapping, especially for the larger objects. I can straighten this base off. So I select Control, right click that base to select it all. Scale Y0. The scale is only X and Y in the UV image editor, because obviously Z doesn't exist for a flat image. Then I'll do the same there, scale Y0. And really I'm doing this just because it will make the next task a little bit easier. As long as the image doesn't look too stretched, it doesn't really matter that we're distorting it slightly. This is just SY0 to do this. And it just flattens it off. I think I may as well go all the way up now as I started. Selecting each one as we go. There's probably a quicker way of doing this. And again though, this obviously is why you may want to UV unwrap your whatever it is you're making before you've put too many vertices in. So for example, before you've applied any subsurf modifiers, because then you'll have a lot more vertices to correct. So they're now all horizontal, they're flat. So I now select this one edge, Control Plus, when it's somewhere around the middle. I'm now going to scale on the x-axis -1. Looks like a disaster, but hopefully things are going to work out. So GX, so it only moves on the x-axis now. I probably should have straightened up at least the middle one, but it doesn't matter too much. I'm just rotating it slightly, moving on the X again, and what I'm trying to do is line up that edge, and really that edge as well. So let's have a look. It's better. I wouldn't say it was right yet, and there are other ways of doing this. Depends really on how close the object's going to be and so on. That'll do for now. It's by no means right, and I also need to do something with this. If we rotate it, scale it on the x-axis, we'll start to get a bit more detail there. So that's not perfect, but for the tutorial purposes that's fine. So you can do that sort of thing to try to improve the effect. Obviously you can see this is tiled, and you might move that around. So for example, you might move that around somewhere where it's less obvious. You can see that's a bit better there now. So that's our first tree, and it's UV unwrapped. We would do a little bit more with the texture, and I think we will do that now. So I'll turn my lights on. I usually have, as my default setting in another layer, just some 3 simple lights so that it helps me when I'm modelling things and texturing them. So we'll go to rendered mode, and we'll go to the node editor again up here. Look at our texture again, because it makes it easy to see. I'll take that off there. and I'll put the colour straight into displacement. I don't think I need to select any particular colours, but what I will want to do is reduce the depth a little bit. So I'll plug the colour back in, and there's an additional thing I want to do, which is to add a mix shader. That goes there, and then add a glossy shader. So this gives the bark a little bit of a sheen, or it will do. So that's obviously way too shiny at the moment, that's very wet bark. So first of all, we can change the brightness of that reflection by turning this factor here down. So I think we'll put it down to 0.05, and then we can vary the sharpness of the reflections by here. So if we turn this to 0, it still looks very wet, even though it's a much less bright reflection. But in reality, I think it's more just a sort of sheen than a shine, I suppose. We'll accept that for now. We might perhaps put a slight, although normally you don't do this for these sort of things, but perhaps a slight yellow cast to it as well. So that's our basic tree, and what we now need to do is to create some variations. Now the more you create, arguably the more realistic your forest will look, because obviously in real life every tree is different, like every person. For this tutorial I'll just create 2 variations. The actual size of them is not so important. What's more important is their proportions to their size and things like that. So if, for example, I take this one, I scale it and I say Shift Z, this lets me make a much thicker tree. So it will be, whether it's taller or not, it will be much thicker. And I might perhaps cut this twig off at that point. Add a face in there, and there we go. Perhaps add another vertex there. So it's just got a little stump. Oh, we've got a stray vertex there. Okay. And for this one we'll do the opposite. Scale Shift Z, and we'll make it a much thinner tree, so arguably a younger tree. And as I said before, we can do things like grabbing a face down here, turn on proportional editing, make it a bit smaller than that, and just pull and push some of the vertices, or the faces in this case, just to give a bit more of an impression of some roots. And I'm doing it by just fairly randomly, because obviously that's what they would be. So I haven't spent a lot of time on it, but there they are. So there's my 3 basic trees. So I select them all, Control G, and that will create a group. And I'll call that tree group. I'll set the material to bark, in case I need to come back to it. And we'll make sure that each one's called a tree. So I've now got a group for my trees. So we'll come back to here. I'm probably going to have to rotate these, almost always have to. Save that. We'll come back now to our main layer. So the first thing I want to do is actually define where the path is before I put any trees on here, and you'll see why in a moment. So we'll go into edit mode, unselect everything, press C to have a selection come up. I'll have it slightly at an angle so that I can see what I'm doing, and we'll have it about that sort of size, and we'll just run the selection down like that. At the moment I'm not doing any sort of variation, I'm just saying, defining that there will be no trees in this area. Now if I look at my camera view, I will need to move my camera around, but there are areas where I don't really need any trees because the camera can't see in that area. So I'll raise it up a little bit. So here, for example, and here, I really don't need trees. So I can also select all those areas. Don't go too close to the camera, because otherwise you'll take away too many. So that's, I'll now look above. Just finish those selections. So the camera can see this area where there won't be any trees, and it can't see these areas, so there's no point in having trees there. It'd be wasted vertices. So now I can come over to here, Object Data, and select that plus button to add a group, which is a vertex group, and we'll call this No Trees. And don't forget to click Assign, and then to check that it's assigned, press A to deselect everything, and then click Select, and there it is. So we've now defined where we don't want any trees. Now come over to the far right hand side. This bar's a bit longer now that they've added this Render Layers button, and we click the Particle button. Click plus and try to name them, because if you don't, it's going to be difficult later on with knowing which one you're changing. So the name and the settings are both called trees. We probably don't want 1,000 trees, so we'll just set that to 100 at the moment. Start on frame 1 and end on frame 1, and you can see now the dots have all appeared, and if I just press play, you see they'll fall through the bottom. But this is, at the moment, this isn't an animation anyway. So then scan down. We don't need any physics, and come down to what we render, set that to group. We do want to render the emitter, so if that's not ticked, you need to tick it, otherwise your ground will disappear when you render. And then we need to select dupli group, so that's the group that it's going to gather its duplications from, and that's the tree group. And we can just see some very small trees there. Click rotation and pick random. This is normally the case. I find I normally do have to rotate my tree, so I've brought in the layer with the trees on it, select the trees, and it's usually the y-axis, rotate y90, and now you can see they're standing up. So we come back to this layer. Now they're obviously a little on the small side, and they're also just coming out at the normals. Now, while small plants might be affected by the slope and so on, this gentle slope that is, trees much less so. So it's up to you. You can use the slope if you want to, but I think trees at this sort of angle would look a bit strange. So I'm going to make them a bit bigger first of all. Let's try 0.25. Still too small. There's still probably too many of them as well. So 0.5, and we can see they're still way too small, so we'll set it to 1. That's getting toward the right size. It's way too many though, I think, so we'll set this to 50. And at the moment the trees are appearing everywhere. I think what I will do though is I will change the rotation of the trees first, so we click that so we can control it, and we'll set the velocity to global Z. Now you can see they're all bolt upright. We will want to add a little variation on that, but we'll worry about that in a moment. So if we have a look, our trees are relatively evenly distributed all over the place. So if we come down to the bottom, under vertex groups, we can change the density. Click that and our No Trees vertex group comes up. Hit that. Now because of the way I selected it, you can select the opposite way around. At the moment it's showing trees exactly where we don't want them, so we just click negative, and there we go, they've changed over to the other side. So we can now have a look and see if that's where we want it. Now you see what I was saying about the trees, we're going to need to move those down. So before we go any further, I can see I've got a small tree there that's not beneath the ground because of where the origin is. So I'm going to select that small tree, go into edit mode, select all the vertices and just move it down a little bit, and then I'll do the same with that tree and the same with that one. Go back to here, go back to my camera view, and there you go, you can see that it's now in the ground. If you don't like that particular distribution of trees, you can change it by clicking here. Now you can see they're still not quite big enough, so we'll go for 1.5. They're definitely big enough now. In fact, there's way too many of them now, so we'll go for 25 trees. And now we can play with the seed, because that will change where the trees are appearing. We still need to move it down. I've got quite an extreme slope there, I think. We just play around with that till we get something that we think is beginning to look like what we want in terms of the placement. I think the first seed wasn't that far off actually. It's nice to have some closer, some further away, and I will add some variation in there vertical angle as well, and I'll just think I'll bring them down a little bit. You have to try to ignore what's outside the camera view, because that's obviously not what you're going to see. And we'll go with that for now, and again though, it needs to be brought down a little bit more, particularly for that one. So you've got some gaps in the trees and so on. Still, that one needs bringing down, so I think they all three do. Okay, it's not perfect, but that'll do for now. And you can, of course, move the ground around. You can pull it up and push it down. Now, at the moment, you'll notice not only all the trees bolt upright, they're all facing the same way. Not ideal. You'll certainly see that they're all duplicates. It's placed it's selected them randomly, but they're all facing the same way. So what we need to do now is add some variation in the phase, which is just here. So phase itself just rotates the trees, but add the random element and you should find they will start to rotate in a more variable way. It's not as random as I'd like, I must say. I've always found that to be the case, but it's a start. Now you will also want to, as I say, have more trees than I've made, and also if you want perhaps more small trees than big trees, one of the things you can do, there is a function that allows you to specify how many occurrences of one particular tree or one particular object, but I've found that Blender has a tendency to crash when you use that. So I'll also, you can duplicate them like that, but you can also then rotate them, and in this case on the x-axis, and that will add to the variation that you get. So now you can see we're starting to get some more random variation in the angle there, and we now need to add some variation in their vertical direction. So we just put a little bit of random there, not too much because it'll look like there's been a meteor strike or something otherwise. Just a little bit. So that's the start of it. If we turn on materials, you can see a rough approximation of what it is. And again, the other thing you might do when you make variations of the trees is move the texture round. So you go to the UV image editor and move the texture map around so you don't keep getting the same patches, as it were, appear. And if I turn my lights on and then put that to rendered, obviously the lights aren't very bright at the moment, but you can start to see what's going on. So at this point, to start to help us see what we're doing, I'm going to add a background texture. So we come here to the world and we add an environment texture. Go to our textures and we choose one. So in my case, there were several I looked at. The one I use at the moment, I'll use this one here. So we open that image, and then if we go to rendered, you can see at the moment it does not match. If you're in orthographic, by the way, those background images don't really work. So you can see there's an image there, but it's not quite what we're looking for yet. But what I often do, just to save the messing around here, is I'll add a mesh, and it will be an image as plane, which is an add-on you can select, or just add a plane and then add an image to it. So I'll say image as plane. We'll go to textures, landscape, and we'll select this one. Rotate X90, there it is. Scale it up and select this to be an emission. And there you can see we can now move this around to get it where we want it. I'll put the border render back on. And although we don't have a real sun in the scene at the moment, you can now see how that lines up. The environment texture will sort of gives you some of the illumination, so the sort of green illumination and so on that goes in here. But you can already see this is starting to line up. We need to change the size of the texture on the ground. So to do that, very similarly, I'll use the node editor this time, it's a bit easier. Make sure the ground is selected. and we need to put in the texture coordinate node, which is going to be, I'm going to use the UV one, and then under vector mapping, that there, so UV coordinates in, mapping coordinates out, and then we can set this to say 2 and 2, which should give us a smaller texture, or 4 and 4, and there you can see it's smaller still, so you just have to find the right scale for you. I think about 3 is probably somewhere near actually. And although you might start to see the repeating of the pattern, that'll be obscured when we start to put more vegetation in here. So at this point I think we'll actually add a sun just to help us. So I'll go into here and I'm going to remove my standard lights, or these two anyway. I'm going to give this lamp, make it slightly yellow. I'll make it slightly smaller too. The size of the lamp will affect how sharp the shadows are. So we want a certain amount of sharpness if it's supposed to be sun, but that means we'll then need to turn the brightness up. So I'll set it to 60 for now. We'll bring the land back and we need to position it. It's a bit low at the moment. So we'll have a look and see what that looks like. Just save it there. So yes, it needs to be quite a bit brighter. Try 300. And you see it's starting to get there now. So we'll try 600. And obviously it's taking a little bit more time now because there's a lot more light rays to render, and it's starting to come up. And what we can also do is we can go to our world map, which is also contributing some of the light, and increase the level of that. What I did in the other scene, in fact, and I'll do that now, is I even added something, another light source above. I'll just push this back a bit further. I thought we'd lost some of the trees then. I'll add another plane, scale it to 20, put it above here, and we're going to simply add an emission texture. It's very big, so any light that it gives out will be quite strong. We'll put it at 0.5 for the moment, and we'll make it a sort of pale blue. So it's representing this light that comes from the sky really, and we'll see what that looks like. So you can see we're getting a slightly blue shade up here now. I think what I'll also do is we'll make this lamp a little bit bigger. It's a little bit too small at the moment, and we'll bring it this way a little bit, and then we'll see what that looks like. And we probably don't need to be quite so bright now. And obviously you can play around and experiment with different angles for the lamp. In this case, in this scene, the light is actually from quite high up, so probably where I've got it right now isn't ideal. And you do need to spend a little bit of time to try to match that, obviously. So that's a little bit more vertical, it's possibly still a little bit too bright. And you just have to play around with these, obviously. We'll go with that for now. So that's given us the basics of the trees, and that's now a path which is somewhat lining up with what's going on in the background. And you may need to colour grade the back or the foreground as well so that they line up better. Essentially everything else you do is about following the same process. So for example, if I open up my original scene, which is down here, we have a look at that. It's very much the same. I did create a plane down here which I made work like water, which I've done in other tutorials, essentially just a flat reflective surface, and then I added a couple of trees in manually, as it were, without using particles, and then started to add a lot more particle systems. So for example, if I turn this particle system on, it'll take a moment to update because there's a lot of vertices in there. I will go into this in the next part of this tutorial. You can see that's added a load of plants there. I also added things like stones. So you can see what tends to happen is as you add more and more particles, It will work, but it can take quite a long time to update, as you can see. So I hope you find that useful. I will go to the next step, which is to create the plants, and then we'll use more particle systems to add those. We'll add some stones down the middle of the path, as it were, and just some little pools of water in the middle as well. So I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Bye then.